November 14, 1944, Hurtgen Forest, Germany. The Hurtgen Forest had become one of the most notorious battlegrounds of World War II. Located on the western border of Germany, near the Belgian frontier, this dense forest stretched for miles, its twisted trees, steep ravines, and muddy trails creating a maze that confounded even the most seasoned soldiers. It was a place where visibility rarely exceeded a few yards, and where the enemy could be lurking behind every tree and rock, just out of sight. By November 1944, the Allies had crossed into Germany, following the successful campaigns in France and Belgium. After the liberation of Paris, the American forces, along with their British and Canadian allies, had pushed deeper into German territory. But in the dense woods of Hurtgen, the advance slowed. The German Wehrmacht, though badly weakened, still held positions in the forest, determined to delay the Allied advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. For the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, the task was simple in theory. Break through the German defensive line in Hurtgen, secure a foothold in Germany, and push on toward the heart of the Reich. However, the forest's natural terrain and the tenacious German defenders made this operation anything but simple. The woods were filled with machine gun nests, mortars, and hidden snipers, making it nearly impossible to advance without suffering significant casualties. The American infantry was bogged down, unable to move quickly through the mud, fog, and dense trees. Air superiority, so often a key factor in battles elsewhere, was rendered useless by the thick canopy overhead. This made the 9th Infantry Division, one of many divisions tasked with breaking the line in Hurtgen, vulnerable. Over the course of several weeks, the division sustained heavy casualties in an effort to push through, with minimal success. The terrain, combined with increasingly harsh weather conditions, forced the men into a brutal, slow-moving battle of attrition. It wasn't long before the soldiers understood that their fight was no longer just about capturing territory. It was about survival. In the midst of this grim situation, one small, isolated group found itself in a fight unlike any they had imagined. 9 American soldiers, part of a larger platoon, found themselves cut off from the main force by a German counteroffensive. Surrounded by roughly 300 German troops, these men were left to make their stand in a patch of the forest. With no hope of reinforcement and little hope of escape, their mission, if it could even be called that, was simple: hold their position as long as possible, delay the German advance, and prevent the enemy from breaking through the American lines. The 9th Infantry soldiers had already seen their share of combat. They were experienced, but no amount of training or battle-hardened toughness could prepare them for the cold, suffocating reality of being trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded on all sides, with no escape in sight. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, these men would fight back, refusing to surrender. Their defense would soon become a symbol of American courage, resilience, and the will to fight, even when victory seemed impossible. The German forces that surrounded the 9 American soldiers were not random troops thrown together in haste. They were a mix of highly trained soldiers from elite Wehrmacht and SS units. The Germans had been entrenched in Hurtgen for months, crafting defensive positions that took full advantage of the natural terrain. As the Allies advanced, the Germans knew they would have to fight tenaciously to slow the American momentum and buy time for their own reinforcements. Every position in the forest, every narrow path, and every ridge had been fortified with deadly intent. The soldiers who surrounded the Americans on November 14, 1944, were likely part of a larger German counterattack that aimed to break through the American lines and disrupt their advance. Their goal wasn't just to push back the Allies, it was to create fear and confusion, to make the price of the Allied victory in the Hurtgen Forest too high. The Germans had known since the battle for the forest began that the Americans were struggling with the terrain and the weather. They saw the Allies' commitment to push forward as both a strength and a weakness, and they sought to capitalize on it. For the German forces, the terrain of Hurtgen was an equalizer. Their positions in the dense woods and the narrow ravines afforded them natural camouflage. They could fire on the Americans from hidden machine gun positions, duck into foxholes at the first sign of retaliation, and reappear when the Americans least expected it. The German snipers, in particular, were trained to take advantage of these conditions. They could watch the advancing Americans for hours, picking off soldiers one by one. Their strikes were precise, methodical, and deadly. In the midst of this deadly stalemate, the 9 American soldiers found themselves isolated, cut off from their platoon and their commanding officer. They were deep behind enemy lines, with no reinforcements on the way. To make matters worse, they were surrounded on all sides. A defensive position, once a strength, was now a trap. They had no choice but to fight back or surrender, but surrender was not an option. For these 9 men, the forest was both a prison and a battleground. They had to rely on every ounce of training they had received to survive. The Americans knew that the Germans had the advantage in numbers, firepower, and experience in this kind of terrain. But they also knew something the Germans couldn't see: their will to fight. The Americans were determined not to give up, no matter how dire the situation seemed. The hours stretched on, and the Germans began to close in. They fired in bursts, advancing cautiously through the trees, probing for weaknesses. The 9 Americans fought back with whatever they had left: their rifles, grenades, and small arms. They fired from behind trees, from the cover of boulders, and from the ground itself. The sound of their rifles echoed through the forest as they picked off German soldiers, one after another. Each shot was a calculated risk. The soldiers knew that they could not afford to waste a single bullet, especially as the enemy closed in around them. The American soldiers had already witnessed the horrors of war, the loss of comrades, the brutality of battle, and the unrelenting nature of the German counteroffensive. But this stand in the Hurtgen Forest, surrounded by an overwhelming force, would test them in ways they never anticipated. With their backs to the wall and no room to retreat, the 9 soldiers fought not just for survival, but for something more: their pride, their comrades, and their country. In the face of impossible odds, they made the decision to stand and fight. Despite being surrounded, despite the odds stacked against them, the 9 American soldiers refused to surrender. They knew that if they were to die, they would die on their feet, fighting for the chance to live. And it was this defiant spirit, this unwavering resolve, that would become the defining feature of their stand. A stand that, against all expectations, would go on to become one of the most legendary moments of the battle. The human angle. 9 men against the odds. The human element of war often gets lost in the larger strategy, but in the case of these 9 soldiers, their stand was defined by something deeply personal. For them, it wasn't just about survival. It was about facing the enemy with courage, dignity, and defiance. These were not faceless soldiers. Each had a backstory, a family, a reason for fighting. The pressure of being isolated and outnumbered weighed heavily on them. Some were veterans of earlier battles. Others were fresh from training, facing their first real taste of combat. But what bound them together was a common determination to hold out for as long as possible. In the dense, claustrophobic forest, they fought with everything they had. Each man had his own way of coping with the pressure. Some focused on their training, relying on the skills they had learned in boot camp and during their service. Others found solace in camaraderie, drawing strength from the bond they shared. In the darkest moments, when the Germans seemed to close in from all sides, their shared resilience kept them fighting. Despite the terror of the situation, they knew that surrender was not an option. It wasn't just the fear of death, it was the fear of failing their comrades, failing the men they had trained alongside, fought alongside. It was a fight for honor. For these soldiers, survival was secondary to doing their duty, no matter how overwhelming the odds seemed. And in that moment, in the depths of the Hurtgen Forest, they became a symbol of unwavering courage in the face of despair. The tactical angle, holding the line. In warfare, tactics are the difference between life and death, and the 9 American soldiers trapped in Hurtgen Forest relied on every tactical advantage they could muster to hold their position. The German forces outnumbered them by at least 30-1, and the terrain worked against them at every turn. The forest, though it provided some cover, also obscured sight lines and made movement slow and difficult. The soldiers knew that they couldn't afford to wait for the Germans to come to them. They had to take the initiative. One of the first tactical decisions made was to use the natural features of the forest to their advantage. The soldiers dug in behind fallen trees and dense underbrush, camouflaging themselves from the enemy. Their rifles, equipped with scopes and iron sights, allowed them to pick off advancing German troops, one at a time, using stealth and surprise. They understood that their greatest asset was not the volume of their firepower, but the precision of their shots. To make the most of their dwindling ammunition, the Americans used the environment to create choke points. They forced the Germans to approach through narrow paths and exposed areas where they could be engaged at a distance. When German troops attempted to flank them, the soldiers adapted their tactics, using grenades and small arms fire to push them back. Every decision was calculated. There was no room for error. Every soldier knew that their ability to hold the line depended on being patient, deliberate, and focused. This tactical approach, though born of necessity, was a perfect example of how small unit cohesion and ingenuity could make a difference, even against overwhelming odds. The soldiers adapted to the terrain and used it against the Germans, turning what should have been a desperate last stand into a prolonged defense that would go on to be remembered as a testament to their skill and resolve. The German perspective. Underestimating the Americans. From the German side, the situation must have seemed like a routine engagement. The American platoon was isolated, cut off from its reinforcements, and surrounded by German forces. A quick assault, they must have thought, would crush the Americans and push them further into retreat. The Germans were experienced, battle-hardened troops used to fighting in the dense forests of the Ardennes and Hurtgen. They knew how to move through the terrain, how to exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses, and how to capitalize on moments of vulnerability. But what they did not anticipate was the stubborn resolve of the American soldiers they faced. The Germans expected the Americans to surrender or flee after being overwhelmed, but these 9 soldiers refused to give in. The Germans, though confident in their numbers, were caught off guard by the determined resistance they encountered. They expected an easy victory, a quick mop-up operation, but instead found themselves bogged down, fighting an enemy that refused to break, even when surrounded. This unexpected resistance caused confusion among the German troops. As their numbers grew, so did their fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the Americans' resolve. The German commanders had underestimated the American ability to adapt to the situation, to use the forest to their advantage, and to fight back when surrounded. For the Germans, it became clear that the Americans they had been trained to dismiss were not just another opposing force. These were soldiers willing to fight to the last breath to protect their comrades and complete their mission. Leadership and heroism. Command under fire. In the chaos of battle, leadership is often the thin thread that holds a unit together. And in the Hurtgen Forest, the 9 American soldiers facing overwhelming odds relied on the leadership of their platoon commander. This leader was a man who, despite the dire situation, did not lose his composure. The men under his command looked to him for direction, and he understood that his actions, his words, and even his silence could inspire or break his soldiers. In the face of being surrounded, with no hope of immediate reinforcements, the commander made the critical decision to fortify their position and fight. Instead of panicking, he kept the men focused on the task at hand, survival and holding the line. His leadership was calm but resolute, and it was this steady hand that ensured the men would not give in. Every decision, where to place the last remaining grenades, when to pull back or advance, how to use the terrain to maximum effect, was made with precision and clarity. His example inspired heroism in the others. In moments of crisis, the men didn't just fight because they had to. They fought because they believed in the leadership that guided them. It was this trust in their commander, and in one another, that allowed them to stand firm in the face of what seemed like certain death. They knew they weren't alone. Their leader was beside them, making the same choices and sacrifices. In war, heroism often emerges from this bond of mutual trust, and it was no different here. The 9 men were not simply soldiers following orders. They were comrades in arms, united by their leader's example. Technological weaponry, the tools of survival. In the claustrophobic and perilous environment of the Hurtgen Forest, the weapons and equipment used by the soldiers became vital to their survival. The American soldiers, though vastly outnumbered, were not without their advantages. They carried M1 Garand rifles, semi-automatic weapons that allowed them to fire quickly without needing to manually reload after each shot. This gave them an edge in firefights, allowing them to lay down sustained suppressive fire against the advancing German forces. Alongside the M1911 pistol, Browning automatic rifles, bars, and a small stockpile of grenades, the Americans had enough firepower to take on a significantly larger force, but only if used wisely. The M1 Garand, in particular, was a weapon of choice for the American infantry, favored for its accuracy and reliability. It allowed each soldier to fire up to 8 rounds in quick succession, making it effective in the dense, close-quarters combat that the Hurtgen Forest demanded. As the German forces attempted to close in on the Americans, the M1917 Enfield sniper rifles and Browning machine guns were used strategically to target German snipers, machine gunners, and officers. This made every shot count. For the Germans, their Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifles, equipped with ZF-39 scopes, were a perfect match for the dense forest terrain. These rifles were renowned for their precision, ideal for picking off targets at a distance. The Germans also relied heavily on machine guns, which were especially deadly in the narrow, confined spaces of the forest. The MG-42, in particular, was infamous for its high rate of fire, capable of cutting down soldiers in the blink of an eye. The heavy reliance on these weapons made it clear that the battle was not just a test of courage and determination. It was a struggle of firepower, with both sides using their weapons to try to outmaneuver and outlast the other. But in the end, the most important weapon was not the rifle or the grenade, it was the soldiers themselves. Their ability to adapt, to think on their feet, and to make the most of the limited resources they had available ultimately made the difference in their stand. The psychological battle. Mind over matter. The battle for survival in the Hurtgen Forest was as much psychological as it was physical. The 9 American soldiers, surrounded on all sides, faced not only the threat of death, but the crushing weight of isolation. They were cut off from any potential help, their comrades miles away, unable to reach them. The psychological toll of this isolation was immense. Hours stretched into days. Every minute was filled with anticipation, every shadow in the trees a potential enemy. The German forces, well trained in psychological warfare, had long understood the power of fear in warfare. They used the environment against their enemies, exploiting the fog, the trees, and the deep ravines to disorient and confuse. The Americans were made to feel small, insignificant, and exposed. But it was the American soldiers' ability to resist that fear, to push it aside and focus on the task at hand, that kept them alive. Each shot fired was a small victory, an affirmation of their will to survive. When they heard the sound of German soldiers moving closer, the fear was palpable. But they did not give in. They fought through the exhaustion, the freezing cold, the hunger, and the fear of imminent death. In the silence between gunshots, they found resolve. In the moments of waiting, they found focus. It was this mental toughness that defined their stand, not just their ability to hold a position, but their ability to stand firm mentally against a force far greater than their own. This psychological battle played out in real time, not just through the soldiers' individual actions, but in their collective spirit. The Germans, accustomed to overpowering their enemies, found themselves facing something they didn't expect. Men who would not break, who would not flee, and who would continue to fight even when there seemed to be no hope. For the American soldiers, it was this refusal to give up, to remain mentally strong even when surrounded, that became the core of their survival. The fog seemed thicker than ever that November 14, 1944. It hung like a dense curtain, the cold moisture seeping into every seam of the soldiers' clothing, their breath visible in the freezing air. For the 9 American soldiers, it wasn't just the enemy that pressed in on them. It was the forest itself, its twisted branches, its maze-like corridors, its overwhelming silence between bursts of gunfire that seemed to close in tighter with every passing minute. They were surrounded. Cut off, outnumbered. The radio had been dead for hours. The platoon had sent no word of their situation. It was just the 9 of them, huddled together in the underbrush, trying to make themselves as small as possible, knowing that the Germans were closing in. At first, it was just the sound of boots on the wet ground, the Germans moving through the forest, cautiously but steadily. Every soldier in the group held his breath, instinctively drawing closer to the earth beneath him, blending into the mud and leaves. They all knew what came next. The German forces, with their superior numbers, would attempt to flush them out, and if they couldn't break the Americans, they would simply wait them out. But the Americans weren't ready to surrender. Not yet. They had a job to do, and that job was simple: survive. Theirs was not a battle for territory or glory, but one for the very chance to keep breathing. The first shot broke the tension. It came from somewhere off to the right, a sharp, echoing crack that cut through the air. A soldier in the front fell forward, his rifle slipping from his hands. The crack of the bullet, distant but clear, was the unmistakable sound of a German sniper firing from a concealed position. The bullet had found its mark with perfect precision. In that moment, everything changed. The 9 soldiers, once holding their breath in tight formation, now knew the Germans knew they were there. The ambush had begun. The immediate fear of the first shot turned into a quiet determination. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes said it all. They were not going to die quietly. The platoon leader motioned for them to stay low, and then, almost imperceptibly, he gave the signal. A series of small hand gestures passed between the soldiers. In this fight, communication wasn't made with words. It was made with the silent language of experience. They had been trained for this, but nothing could truly prepare them for the moment they were about to face. The first move came from the American sniper. He was positioned at the rear of their makeshift defensive line, keeping watch for any movement that might betray a German advance. His rifle was trained on the tree line ahead, his eyes scanning every inch of the fog-enshrouded landscape. In a tense moment of stillness, he noticed a flicker, a glint of light off a German scope, hidden in the folds of the forest. The German sniper was watching them, waiting for the perfect shot. The American marksman adjusted his scope and carefully lined up the shot. His hands were steady, despite the adrenaline that surged through his veins. He knew the stakes. One mistake, one missed shot, could cost them their lives. But he also knew that this fight wasn't just about shooting. It was about denying the Germans the advantage. They couldn't allow themselves to be picked off, one by one. This was their stand. If they didn't make their shots count, there would be no second chance. As the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, the German sniper shifted slightly, exposing just enough of his position. The American took his shot. The crack of the rifle echoed sharply through the trees. It was a clean shot, precise, controlled. The German sniper collapsed, his rifle falling silent. The 9 Americans held their collective breath as they watched the body slump behind a tree. One down. But the fight was far from over. The Germans had now fully committed. The sounds of boots grew louder. Their tactic was simple: overwhelm, encircle, and take prisoners. They would advance, using the trees and the fog for cover, forcing the Americans to reveal themselves. They knew it would be a matter of time before their position became untenable. But, for the 9 men crouched in the underbrush, their will to resist was stronger than the weight of the enemy's numbers. With the first sniper down, the Americans rallied. They knew that every movement, every second of silence, was critical. They would not wait for the Germans to make the first move again. They would force the issue, using the trees and the forest to block the Germans' advance. As the German forces began their push forward, they could no longer count on the element of surprise. The Americans were now firing back, their shots echoing through the trees as they used the cover to their advantage. Every shot from the American rifles was met with return fire from the German side. It was a battle of attrition. Who would break first? The Germans had the numbers, but the Americans had the resolve. The first wave of Germans approached the American position cautiously. But they were now met with resistance. As the Americans fired from behind their cover, they forced the Germans to think twice about charging forward. The sound of machine guns in the distance signaled that the German reinforcements were closing in. The Americans were outnumbered, but they had one key advantage. They knew this fight wasn't just about surviving. It was about making sure the Germans knew they had fought with everything they had. The forest, once quiet and still, had erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. The Germans, realizing their previous attempts at infiltration had failed, began advancing in earnest, pushing forward through the dense trees. The sound of boots crunching in the underbrush and the sharp bursts of machine gun fire filled the air. The Germans, emboldened by their superior numbers, were determined to close in on the Americans, to crush them under the weight of their overwhelming force. For the 9 American soldiers, this was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a fight for survival. With their ammunition dwindling and their position growing increasingly untenable, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on their shoulders. They had already watched one of their own fall to a sniper's bullet. The body of their fallen comrade lay in the mud, a stark reminder of how quickly things could change in the heat of battle. But the 9 Americans had something the Germans did not: a refusal to give up. The first German wave was met with precision. The American marksman, now fully in his element, fired again. Another shot, another German soldier down. The rifle crack echoed through the fog as the sniper continued his deadly work, taking out targets at a distance. The forest was his arena, and the Germans, advancing in clusters, were easy prey. He kept his shots controlled, methodical, each one landing exactly where he aimed. Despite the ferocity of the German assault, the Americans remained calm. They had trained for this moment. They knew their rifles. They knew the terrain. They knew their position was weak, but they also understood the Germans would have to come to them. The Americans were not just defending the forest. They were turning it into a trap. As the Germans pushed forward, their soldiers became increasingly frustrated. They had underestimated the Americans' ability to hold their ground. With every advancing German soldier who fell, the air grew heavier with tension. The sound of their comrades dying triggered a shift in their tactics. No longer did they charge forward in disorganized waves. The Germans began to move cautiously, attempting to flank the Americans and isolate their position. The Americans, meanwhile, adapted. They set up small, improvised barricades using fallen trees and rocks, creating choke points to force the Germans into narrow fields of fire. They fired their remaining grenades into the approaching German lines, causing even more confusion. The sound of explosions mingled with the harsh crack of rifles, creating a battlefield symphony of chaos and death. One of the soldiers, positioned at the far right of the perimeter, spotted movement through the trees. A small group of German soldiers, moving cautiously, were attempting to flank their position. Without hesitation, the American soldier fired, his shot finding its mark, sending one of the Germans tumbling into the mud. The others scattered, retreating into the forest. But the damage had been done. The Americans had proven once again that they were not easily broken. It was in this moment that the Germans began to falter. The sheer frustration of facing a small group of soldiers who refused to surrender took its toll. The German command, watching from the rear, could not understand why their soldiers were unable to break the Americans. They had surrounded the 9 men. They had outnumbered them by over 30-1. And yet, despite every advantage, they were losing ground. On the other side, the Americans knew their fate hung in the balance. But there was something deeper than fear that kept them going. They were fighting for one another. Every soldier was keenly aware that they were all that stood between their comrades and death. They had no backup, no reinforcements on the way. It was up to them and the forest to decide their fate. And then, as if the battle had reached its final turning point, the Germans made a fateful decision. Realizing they couldn't advance without suffering even greater losses, they attempted to retreat and regroup. The 9 American soldiers, though battered and exhausted, saw their moment. With a final surge of energy, they pushed forward from their defensive positions, catching the retreating Germans off guard. What had been an overwhelming disadvantage had become an opportunity. They were now forcing the Germans back, one step at a time. The tide of battle shifted in those brief moments. The 9 soldiers, who had been surrounded and outnumbered, now held the initiative. The German advance was halted, and the soldiers' bravery had become their weapon. In the end, it was not just their rifles or grenades that had turned the tide. It was their refusal to give in, their unrelenting resolve to fight, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The German forces, now regrouping in confusion, had lost the element of surprise. The Americans had turned their stand into a symbol of defiance, a stand that would become legend in the days to come. With the Germans pulling back, the 9 soldiers emerged from the chaos, battered but victorious. They had done what most would have thought impossible. They had held their ground, survived, and fought back when all seemed lost. The Hurtgen Forest, with its tangled trees and treacherous undergrowth, would remain a hellish battleground for the American soldiers for weeks. But for the 9 men who had held their position on November 14, 1944, the battle, at least for that day, was over. The German forces, realizing they had failed to break the American lines, began to retreat into the dense woods, leaving behind the bodies of their dead and wounded. The Americans, though fatigued and battered, had survived. The immediate aftermath of the battle was quiet, save for the occasional echo of distant gunfire. The forest remained thick with fog, the air heavy with the smell of cordite, and the earth that had absorbed the blood of both sides. The 9 soldiers, physically drained and emotionally spent, took stock of their situation. They had held out longer than anyone had believed possible. Their ammunition was nearly gone, but they had managed to kill or incapacitate a significant number of the German attackers. The enemy, initially sure of their success, had been driven back. For the 9 soldiers, it was a bittersweet victory. They had lost one of their own in the opening moments of the fight. The scout, who had fallen to the German sniper's bullet, now lay in the dirt, covered only by a thin layer of leaves. His comrades could do little but honor his memory in silence. The men knew that in this kind of battle, loss was inevitable. Yet, they understood that it was their survival, their refusal to surrender, that had allowed them to make it through the day. And, despite the cost, they had managed to break the German assault, buying precious time for their comrades elsewhere in the forest. As they began to move through the forest, the men stopped and took a moment to reflect on their situation. They were still surrounded by enemy forces. Their communications were down, and there was no telling when reinforcements would arrive. But their survival meant something. They had faced the impossible, and they had made it through. They had proven that courage, resolve, and resourcefulness could turn the tide of battle, even in the most desperate of circumstances. In the following days, the American command began to take notice of their actions. Reports filtered back to higher command about the small group of soldiers who had held their ground against overwhelming odds. The story quickly spread through the ranks, and what had initially seemed like a hopeless stand became a symbol of the kind of resilience that the American forces needed in the face of an enemy that was refusing to give up, no matter how many setbacks they faced. The platoon leader, who had been at the forefront of the action, received a commendation for his leadership in the field. His ability to maintain calm under pressure, to lead his men in the most dire of situations, was a testament to his training and experience. The 9 soldiers' refusal to break under the weight of the enemy's numbers was not just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of the indomitable spirit that defined the American soldier. But the personal toll on the men was undeniable. In addition to the grief they felt for their fallen comrade, the soldiers had also endured the brutal psychological strain of being in constant combat. They had seen death close up, had fought not just against an enemy, but against their own exhaustion and fear. The weight of that experience would follow them long after they left the forest. Some would recover in time. Others, scarred by the intensity of the battle, would carry the memories of that stand with them for the rest of their lives. Despite the triumph, there was little time for reflection. The campaign in Hurtgen was far from over. The Americans would continue to press forward, but they knew that every inch of ground would be fought for at great cost. The Germans, though momentarily pushed back, were far from defeated. The battle for the forest would drag on for weeks, and more lives would be lost before the final victory could be claimed. The immediate aftermath of the 9 Americans' stand in the Hurtgen Forest resonated far beyond the confines of that isolated patch of woods. The German forces, though beaten back, had not been entirely defeated. Their retreat into the forest marked only a temporary shift in momentum. Still, the American soldiers' refusal to break, their ability to withstand the pressure and hold their ground against overwhelming odds, had profound implications on the larger course of the Hurtgen campaign. News of their stand spread rapidly within the American ranks. High Command recognized the significance of their actions, particularly in a campaign marked by frustration and high casualties. The 9th Infantry Division, already struggling to make progress through the dense forest, used the bravery of these 9 soldiers as an inspiration. Reports of the small group of soldiers holding their position against 300 Germans were passed up the chain of command. Their actions were later praised in internal communications as a shining example of perseverance under fire. In an otherwise grim and drawn-out engagement, this stand became a symbol of American resilience. In the broader context of the battle for the Hurtgen Forest, however, the victory was bittersweet. The forest remained a deadly and unforgiving battleground, and while the 9 soldiers had successfully repelled the first assault, their position remained precarious. The German forces, though temporarily pushed back, regrouped quickly. The next phase of the battle was just as intense, and American reinforcements, though slowly making their way forward, were still some distance away. The psychological effect on the American forces was undeniable. In a campaign where victory had been elusive and the loss of life staggering, the successful stand of 9 soldiers offered a small but crucial spark of hope. The Germans were formidable, but they were not invincible. The battle for Hurtgen was still raging, but the American forces knew that if a small group could hold their ground against such overwhelming odds, there was hope that the tide could eventually be turned in their favor. For the 9 soldiers themselves, the aftermath was complex. While they had proven their mettle and accomplished something extraordinary, the price was high. One soldier had already fallen, and though the others survived, they bore the emotional scars of their ordeal. For many, the trauma of battle in such close quarters, the uncertainty of survival, and the fear of losing more comrades would remain with them long after the campaign ended. War, after all, is not easily forgotten. Their stand in the forest became part of the larger story of the Hurtgen Forest campaign, a brutal, weeks-long struggle that would claim thousands of lives on both sides. The battle is often remembered as a tragic chapter in the broader context of World War II. Saturn II, the forest's dense terrain, its unforgiving nature, and the steep toll it took on soldiers who were forced to fight in its confines. The 9 soldiers' actions were ultimately a small part of the campaign's legacy, but their bravery would go on to be etched into the annals of military history. In the months and years following the battle, the story of the 9 soldiers would be passed on as a legend among their comrades and fellow veterans. They were seen not as mere survivors of a hopeless stand, but as men who had defined the meaning of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The story was often told in hushed tones in the barracks and around campfires. It became the tale of ordinary soldiers who, when surrounded and outnumbered, made the extraordinary choice to fight and survive. For the American military at large, their stand in the Hurtgen Forest added a layer of psychological strength to the overall effort. It reinforced the message that even in the darkest moments of war, when victory seemed unreachable, bravery, discipline, and the will to fight could shift the balance in unexpected ways. The stand of those 9 American soldiers in the Hurtgen Forest transcended the immediate tactical situation. It was a testament not just to their courage, but to the enduring spirit of the human will in the face of overwhelming adversity. Surrounded by a force vastly larger than their own, with no reinforcements on the way and no way out, they chose to stand and fight. Not because the odds were in their favor, but because, in that moment, they understood something vital. Surrender was not an option. In the fog of battle, in the thick silence of the forest, where danger lurked behind every tree, the 9 men embodied the very essence of what it means to be a soldier. Their survival was not the result of sheer firepower or technology. It was born from their determination to remain unbroken when the world around them seemed to be falling apart. Their fight wasn't just against German soldiers, it was a battle against fear, against fatigue, and against the psychological toll of being completely surrounded and isolated. Their stand is a reflection of a broader truth in war, that sometimes it is the individual's courage, the collective resolve of a small group, that makes all the difference. The German forces may have outnumbered them, but the soldiers in the Hurtgen Forest proved that resilience, discipline, and the will to endure could defeat even the most formidable opponents. They understood that survival was not just a matter of physical endurance. It was a matter of mental strength. And in that crucible of fear and fire, they demonstrated that, against all odds, one group of men could stand firm and defy the expected outcome. Though the battle raged on, the story of their stand was passed down in whispers among the soldiers. It became a legend, not because they were invincible, but because they showed that when one is pushed to the very edge, what remains is the most powerful force of all, an unbreakable will. And in the harsh, unforgiving woods of Hurtgen, those 9 soldiers became the embodiment of that force, a legacy that would live on long after the battle had ended.